Hello to one and all. Welcome to the Unlearning Economics stream. So I have with me today Claudia Sahm, who is a very well-known macroeconomist who has started her own consulting firm, Sahm, after working at the Federal Reserve and in numerous places. You also write the Substack, which has the name Stay at Home Mum, if I'm not, is that right?
Stay at Home Macro.
Stay at Home Macro, sorry. Yeah. There was Macro Mum before, then there's Stay at Home Macro. Yeah, so yeah, I was getting those mixed up. But yeah, you're just a general massive presence in macroeconomics, I think, and online. So it's so good to speak to you.
Yeah, so good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's get straight into things because there's so much to discuss about the macroeconomy. And in my mind, you've been one of the people tirelessly campaigning for a better economy. Mm-hmm. I think a better economy in terms of the measures that we typically use like GDP and stability and things, but also one that works for people, right? We're keeping an eye on how people are doing, right? So let's start with the rule that's named after you, because there are only two economists that have rules named after them, right? And you're one of them. The other is John Taylor. Yeah. But could you talk us through the Som Rule and how it came about and how it's useful?
Right. So first of all, it's really all kind of embarrassing that it has my name on it, or frankly that it has a name. So although it's great, the attention to it, but the Som Rule was part of a policy proposal that I put together in 2019. I was with a whole group of economists who worked on a volume. It was called Recession Ready, and it was about preparing for the next recession. It came out in early 2019, and the theme of the volume was on automatic or semi-automatic stabilizers. So fiscal policy that is enacted prior to a recession, spells out exactly what the fiscal policies would be in a recession, and then hits it on autopilot. Right, so you tie it to economic conditions, not politics in the crisis as to when the policy goes out. So the Som Rule was really the second fiddle in my policy proposal. Largely, I was talking about why stimulus checks are the right way to help households broadly in a recession, and looked at the research and what had happened, from 2008 to 2010, and the relief to families. And what became known as the Som Rule was just the trigger. Like it was the when do you turn it on? And I had people, because people are fascinating, especially some of my peers, be like, well, how is it that you're the one that came up with this? Like, this is so straightforward. And like, why are you getting credit for this? And I was like, no. But I was trying to solve a problem that was different than the typical problem. I wasn't trying to forecast a recession. There are much more sophisticated, although also imperfect, but much more sophisticated recession forecast tools. This was meant to be we are in a recession with a high degree of likelihood, so not perfect, and get the money out, right? So it was very much, and also people are like, oh, a rule of thumb, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, actually it's a policy rule. Just like the Taylor rule is initially it was more descriptive and now it's more prescriptive of monetary policy, but it's about what should monetary policy do. And the Som Rule is about what fiscal policy should do. Like, it's time, get going. So its origins, but like I still think it's about the fiscal policy.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. We lost you a little bit at the end, but that might be I don't know if people watching lost me. The thing about streaming is you never know if it's your end, their end, or like something with the software, and it appears different for different people. So yeah, great fun. It's a bit of potluck. So it's really interesting that you said that, though, that you said it's originally supposed to be a policy rule, because I actually, I was familiar with the Som Rule and with your output. I followed you for ages, but I did some, revision before this. And I was like, I looked at the Wikipedia page for the Som Rule, and it was like, it's just a recession predictor. It's just a recession, or not predictor, indicator, right?
Indicator,
and I was like, yeah, and I was like, I was like, no, but I'm sure it has something to do with fiscal stimulus. Like Claudia was always talking about fiscal stimulus as a result of the Sahm Rule. And that's interesting that it's been on Wikipedia, it's been narrowed down to just this indicative rule, which arguably takes away the bigger issue of like what you do about it, right? Like that's what you were concerned about.
No, and I mean it, like when you create tools, it's like I want them to be good, but I can't control how people use them. I mean, I remember in 2019 when it first got some attention, like not as much as now, but some attention, someone had like sent me an article about, and there's a trading strategy off it, and I was like, oh my gosh, no, 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 don't do that with this. But it's like, you know, once you create something, I mean, I do spend a lot of time trying to explain it, inform people, help them understand the nuances of it. But I can't, like, as one, you know, example of a painful moment when, I mean, over the last 2.5 years, we've been on like near constant recession watch, right? Like when inflation was high, we had a recession was coming and blah, blah, blah. And then this summer had another bout of that. And I can remember at one point even having the White House, some people I knew there asked me just to make sure that they had it all straight with like the Som Rule calculation and, you know, all this stuff. And they were tracking stuff, and they should be tracking, you know, economic indicators. And unemployment rate, which is what it's based on, absolutely needs attention. But I thought, you know, they didn't ask me, well, what would you do if a recession came? Right? Like I've gotten a lot of questions about the Som Rule, but in moments where it looked a little dicey. I mean, I have had a no recession call on this entire time. So, but when it looked dicey, it was frustrating that I got a lot of calls about the Som Rule triggering, and I didn't get like anything about better fiscal policy. And frankly, the only like really in-depth study I've done on the fiscal side is I had a big project in New Zealand at the beginning of the year on semi-automatic stabilizers and creating a rule for that might work there. And I had an outlet to actually work on the fiscal, which is what I wanted to do. It just wasn't in my home country, you know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's something, isn't it? It's something, I suppose. I mean, can we talk a little bit about the Taylor Rule? Because as I saw it, right, so the Taylor Rule is about interest rate management and recessions, right? It's a monetary policy rule. And yours was basically the fiscal reply to it, right, as far as I see. And yours is kind of in line with Keynesian policy that you need you need to have some kind of fiscal stabilizers as well. So without wanting you to, you know, necessarily criticize the Taylor Rule or John Taylor, I was just wondering, like, what exact gap do you think you're filling there? Like, is it the zero lower bound? Is it about how low interest rates can go? Or is it just something that monetary policy can't do? Because I feel like this is a really big debate that we're having at the moment about fiscal versus monetary policy.
It has been a big mistake of macroeconomic policy that over time, so much emphasis, and I'm thinking particularly in like stabilization policy, it's broader than this, but in stabilization policy, we got to the point where many of the leading macroeconomists would say, the Fed's got this. They would even say the Fed's got this when it came to a recession. Like setting aside the inflation piece, which I think also we overplayed the Fed's ability to really bring it all under control. But like we have as a discipline let fiscal atrophy, right? And I think I get it. Like I love the Fed dearly, right? Like, and it's great because there's a bunch of economists running around. Although thank God, James, I'm so happy we do not have an economist as Fed chair right now. But like it's a very technocratic. It's not partisan. You can really crunch through the numbers and make a decision. That is not how Congress works. Right? Like fiscal policy is inherently messier, but it is also way more powerful. Right? Like you're not just messing around with like, oh, we're going to move an interest rate and see if even other interest rates move the way we want them to. This is like you put money in people's hands. You bail a business out directly. Right? So the fiscal has a real strength to it. And like we needed that. Like I was radicalized on fiscal policy by working at the Fed during the Great Recession and that slow recovery. Because especially as we got out into the recovery, which was so slow, the labor market, like it just, and in the end, because the expansion was really in a good place before the pandemic, that underscored that those years of pain, we didn't have to have them, right? That was really a insufficient policy response. There was even congressmen into austerity. And at the end, it was to the Fed, it's like, well, you just all fix this. And they couldn't, I think the Fed could have probably done a little more, but like really their tools were not fit for purpose. And I put some, again, fiscal policy has a lot of, it's messy and it has a lot going on, but I think that macroeconomists, the people advising policymakers, really just walked away from fiscal and put all their chips in on the Fed. And I think the Fed should have good tools. I think the Taylor rule is a usefulness. You need like guides. I still think the Fed should be doing discretionary policy. I think fiscal could benefit for some more automatic stabilizers to kind of clean up things that we would always do, but they still have to be enacted. So it's not like they aren't ever free of politics. But yeah, I kind of put that on the profession. I think that was a big mistake, and hopefully, like we figure it out because fiscal was a big deal this time.
It's interesting. I mean, somebody's already said this in chat, but the timing of your rule or the Sahm rule becoming popular was pretty fortuitous in a way, right? Because it was like 2019, right? Like just before the pandemic. Now, from what you've said just now, arguably it wasn't fortuitous because it should have been, 2008 or even earlier. Because I think we've had this big experiment, right, where we've proved the efficacy of fiscal policy during the pandemic, but also after it. And that makes the 2008 to 2018 look like a sort of a lost decade, right? A massive amount of wasted potential.
Yeah, and I think the message came through that a robust, widespread fiscal response was necessary in a recession. Right, like 2020, so in 2019, early in the year, Som Rule came out. I left the Fed because I wanted to work with Congress on fiscal policy. Like I've been asked to do congressional testimony, and you cannot do that if you're a Fed staff economist. So I left thinking I could go do good in the world. And I had been working with Senator Bennett's office on a unemployment insurance reform package that included putting like extra payments on autopilot. So it had a Som Rule piece to it, but it was a much bigger. And I mean, it wasn't even 6 months. And the pandemic came, and I had the absolute privilege with Jason Furman, the two of us on March 11th. So the last House Dems breakfast in person. So we spoke at that. That was the night that, the NBA shut down. Trump was like, shut the airspace down. I mean, like this was right when it was all coming. And Jason and I made our push forward. You need to go big. And I mean, I was just like, they did. Like I didn't sleep until the CARES passed the Senate because it was so good. Like I just couldn't believe. Now, it was good that it went through. I'm an absolute CARES was that was the big push you needed in the beginning. I think the rescue plan is the unsung hero of all of this because it was actually that extra push for the recovery. And yet I know that the thing about not having studied big fiscal for many years is like the design issues haven't been as thought through as say with monetary policy. So I've done a lot with stimulus checks and I stand behind those, and all three of those stimulus checks, I'm like, that was money well spent in terms of getting a recovery. And yet, like, there is no way I would have put the biggest check last, right? I had people calling me, press, and be like, oh, President Trump is suggesting $2,000 for that last check. Why? Where did that $2,000 number come from? I'm like, it's bigger than the last one, and it's a round number. I mean, like, there can't. It's like I studied this stuff. There's no way. But for me, like knowing the politics, once it's out there, it's 2,000. Once it gets the Senate's, flipped around and the Democrats and the administration, it's like Biden had a choice between 2,000 or zero. Like that was kind of it. So I had a lot of arguments with like Larry Summers and also Jason Furman at that point didn't agree with those last round of checks. And to me, it was like, yeah, this isn't perfect, and no, this is not how I'd want to design it. And I think in the future, we should have spent more time on design and just be more effective. Like I think those last checks probably could have been smaller, more targeted, but zero would have been too. Like I think on net positive, we benefited from those.
So it's overall a good package, but maybe the last bits of stimulus were too much, and you're not the only person to say that. Can I just because we've got people watching who may not be completely familiar with all of these names, I'd like to delve into each individual part of the stimulus. And to be honest, sometimes I get confused because there's so many acronyms flying around. Right, but you've got, so first the CARES Act, because I think this is one that's really worth talking about in depth as well. So the CARES Act, right? Could you talk us through this and like what it achieved and whether you think it kind of went too far or was taken away too soon and so on?
So the CARES Act, this was the initial relief package, and it was passed in, I don't know, like around the 20th of March. I mean, it is absolutely amazing. I mean, we needed the pandemic was moving fast. It was a very scary time, but it's like, anyone that says the Congress can't get something done, it's like, well, unfortunately, it may take a very big crisis, but they did. They moved so quickly, and they went big. Right. And I think, and it was broad based too. So there were key components for households. So the stimulus checks went out very broadly, and that was, for adults. And then there was a smaller payment for children. For workers, they both dramatically increased the weekly unemployment benefits payments. And they also expanded eligibility to like gig workers, self-employed, people who wouldn't normally be qualified or be eligible for unemployment benefits. On the unemployment benefits, that's the one that I didn't sleep until it passed, because there's a huge debate, long-standing, about if you give unemployed people money, they're not going to want to work because they like to sit at home on their couch and blah, blah, blah. Okay, I mean, it was a pandemic.
Yeah, they just spend it on cigarettes and stuff.
Yeah, we didn't want people to like not have to go to work, die. But the unemployment insurance benefits and where it went in terms of the discourse is a very good example of how much some of our fiscal programs need administrative support and reform. So in the end, the CARES Act added $600 a week to jobless payments. Now that, as people point out, is like, oh well, millions of unemployed people will get more in their unemployment check than they got when they were working, right? And I mean, that kind of sounds like a disincentive, right? You're going to like take a job back and you lose money. So what happened is, when the original proposal from Congress was to take the replacement rate on unemployment insurance up to like 110%. So recognizing it was a pandemic, they did actually want to discourage people from taking work because of the danger. But they went to the unemployment insurance agencies. It's run out at the state level. And some of them said, we can't do that. They said the programs, like computer programs that the UI systems are on, some of them, these are on systems, languages that are so ancient that like you got to go out and find somebody in retirement who still knows the language. So they said, we just can't do that very fast. And I mean, the COVID was moving fast. And they said, what we can do fast is you give us a dollar amount and we'll add it all. And so $600 is what it takes to get the median worker up to 110% replacement rate.
Right.
So it was going to be, too much for half of the workers and not enough for the top half to get to 110. But like, it's like, this is ridiculous. We are the tech capital of the world, and we can't like reprogram, and so that's one where, like, because we weren't prepared to do the policy, and if you had an automatic stabilizer, if you had Congress said, we will do this, then you would be committed to build the infrastructure to do it. We never had that commitment. And so that meant that the program was going to be hamstrung from the get-go. And we shouldn't look at research and say, oh, well, it disincentivized work. It's like, well, but this isn't the policy experiment we really should have been running. We should have had something that was much cleaner. So so CARES, there's unemployment, they had stuff for small businesses. I think that's a piece where I really appreciated the ambitions of it. But it was run through the Small Business Administration, and that is a tiny agency. And that payroll protection program, I think some form of that should happen again in the future. There are other countries like Germany that use subsidies to employers to essentially help them
Mm.
make payroll. And so then the worker doesn't get unemployed. But the way that program was run, there were cases of outright fraud, and the
Right.
administration of it was difficult. Businesses didn't quite know what to do with it. Like it had a lot of difficulties. And in the end, a lot of the estimates are the cost per job saved was really high. But I appreciate seeing, and of course there were various public health aspects that were in the CARES Act.
I mean, the practical realities of these policies are so interesting. It's fascinating to just hear why it might have fallen short and why it's short of like perhaps what an institutionalized Sahm rule might look like, right? Like an actual version of the Sahm rule that was run through its own agency that had the right authorities and had enough funding and everything, right? This was much more ad hoc, and I guess it was, it was the ultimate emergency, right? But it despite its flaws, it did a job, right? It did do a job, and it was like absolutely vital. Let's talk a little bit about the ones sit more, since the lockdowns were gradually ended, right? So the Recovery Act, because you said that's underestimated. So could you, again, probably in a similar style, because it's so interesting to hear from somebody so close to this policy about how it actually works. So the more detail, the better. But like the Recovery Act and like how you think that helped and how that did a lot of the heavy lifting here.
Yeah, so there were three COVID related or kind of COVID economic policies. So there was the CARES Act, which was in March of 2020. In December of 2020, there was a smaller economic package. The first, it had the $600 of the $2,000 checks. So it had a kind of a down payment on the check. It had that, and then it also reinstated some of these extra jobless benefits. So of the three, it's the smallest one, but it was still under President Trump, and it still had some bipartisan support. The CARES Act was just like it passed flat out, like it had full support. This one towards the end of the year, there was a little bit of back and forth, but it passed. And again, we were in like COVID winter, right? Like things were still serious with the pandemic. And then the rescue plan. So that was President Biden's first piece of major legislation, and it passed in March of 2021, and it was not bipartisan. It only got through with the Democrats, and so it got through on the thinnest of margins because it was really close, right, with the Senate. And what was notable / frustrating for someone like me is it was even a very contentious policy on the Democratic side. I had Larry Summers on Christmas Eve, like on Bloomberg, going off about how the American Rescue Plan, or he was trying specifically about the stimulus checks, like the worst economic policy in 40 years. And it's like, first of all, Larry had a hand in what was probably one of the worst economic policies that we've had in many years. Obama's response to the Great Recession was not sufficient. That's really widely accepted, maybe not by him. And hindsight's 2020, right? So it's not to get into it, but it's like to me, a big lesson from the Great Recession and what came after it is like you have to keep pushing. And the unemployment rate was still elevated. It was coming down, but it was like way above where we had done stimulus checks in the past, right? Like the trajectory. But it was still high. The pandemic was still there. It was coming back in waves. And I had the opinion, you just swing for the fences here, right? Like being modest and trying to fine tune. It's like, this is fine when we're in like a fair weather world, but no, it's like you want to err on the side of doing more, not less. Now, inflation did come. Inflation was going to come anyways, and yes, the rescue plan added to it. And I think what's notable after we get past it, the United States, relative to our peer countries, was at the higher end of the fiscal response in 2020. But we weren't, but our peer countries, I mean, really put in a lot of fiscal support, where the U.S. totally, like, nobody else had the rescue. Like, we were the ones
Yeah.
that went in one more time. And the U.S. doesn't have some of the budget rules, the thing that would constrain other countries. But I mean, you look right now at those charts, and there's a lot going on. But if you look at the charts of like inflation adjusted GDP, productivity, I mean, like the U.S. is just like we're off in a different, we're playing a bit different ball game here. Like we're actually on the growth path, and it's a good one. I mean, we're getting GDP numbers that are better than before the pandemic, right? Whereas you've got
Right.
Europe that, I mean, Germany's like flatline. So, and again, it's a lot of things. I don't want to say it's all about the rescue plan, but to me, what has kept us, the rescue plan was instrumental in kickstarting the labor market because it got money in people's hands, it got jobs going, and it's a big question mark. How did we get past the inflation without a recession? Some that other person I mentioned earlier said we have to have a recession. And the way I mean, the COVID drove the inflation. COVID, we did get it under some semblance of control, and like that's a lot of the inflation going away. I also think that we have been so resilient in this episode because our labor market has been so strong. Like the Fed had its like
Yeah.
war on workers for quite a while. I think the Fed should have raised rates, and I think it helped, but like they couldn't break this labor market. I mean, it's not without. I mean, I think, and I'm happy that they're recognizing we don't need to push on it more to like slow it down because everything does have a breaking point. But like the labor market was really crucial, like the strength of it, to getting through this without a recession. And I think the rescue plan absolutely helped give it some oomph, though CARES and the other package in December of 2020 also important. Like I don't try to slice and dice by this was a blue or this was a red policy in terms of Democrat or
Yeah.
Republican.
Yeah, I mean, it's living in the UK where we've had austerity, right? I mean, even the response to the 2008 recession in the USA looks good compared to what we've done, right? And our growth has been terrible. Our cost of living crisis, inflation was higher than I think anywhere else among the richer countries, partly because of Brexit as well as austerity, right?
Yeah.
And public services have declined. The human cost is massive. Inequality is really big, especially between London and everywhere else, right? And it's just the divergence between the USA and the UK and the EU and even individual countries like Germany, which are generally thought to be fairly good places to live. But that divergence now is absolutely enormous, right? It's starting to look, like a sort of, people used to say the first world, second world and third world, right? But it's like the USA has just completely departed. And that is partly because of much better macroeconomic management, I think. And I don't know, it's depressing to me how avoidable that was for us. If you believe the basic Keynesian story, right, which I do, right, and you do, or the Sahmian story, it's so avoidable. There's such a big cost, right? And a lot of people are really struggling.
Sorry,
a lot of people are really struggling. Yeah, it's okay. The picture's a bit better now.
Okay.
A lot of people are really struggling. And people are struggling everywhere, right? People are still struggling in the USA too. But I think one thing that really, really struck me, and this is from reading your Substack as well, right, today, that full employment, right? There are obviously all these policies, welfare policies that can help people, better healthcare policies, better everything policy, better criminal justice policy. But it's incredible to me how much full employment does. How once employers are the ones who are battling for employees, how many different things can be improved, and like that goes from healthcare, increases in wages and conditions, right? Also bringing people in who are maybe less likely to get jobs in the first place. So you talk about people with disabilities. There are also people with criminal records, disproportionately likely to be African Americans. So it's good for racial inequality as well. All these things, it seems like full employment is just like, it's such an excellent policy that has such far-reaching consequences. Do you see it in the same way?
Yeah, no, I'm a big supporter of the dual BandAid. I think, I
Yeah.
mean, in the U.S., I mean, from New Deal era, I mean, the U.S. has a full employment, like Congress has a full employment mandate. Yeah, it was notable in the 70s that it was expanded to the Fed, and in fact, the Fed is a maximum employment mandate, so it does have this like as much employment as possible without inflation. Like it's a little more constricted than the full employment, but yeah, we one aspect in the recoveries, and not just after the Great Recession, but for several decades, we had in the U.S. what were referred to as jobless recoveries. So we just, even when we got past the recession, the unemployment rate dragged along, wage growth wasn't as strong, and what we saw after, I mean, it really started up in 2021. We had the first job full recovery in many decades. Now, it could be, COVID was a very unusual recession. So this could have just been like, regardless of any policy that happened, we would have had this like turn it on, turn it off, and we've had this snapback. I think the policies were important, but regardless of, oh, sorry, yeah, I have to do this on my phone, and now my phone is unhappy with me. Okay,
we still hear you fine.
Okay, you can still see me, yeah. Um, so, but that, like we actually saw a job full recovery. Aaron Dubay has some really great work, I think, with some co-authors, looking at like wage compression. So what does the wage distribution look like? And what happened, and this even started in 2020, you can see this happening, is the low wage workers were really catching up. Like there was a compression, there has been a compression of the wage distribution in recent, like the last 4 years, that like undid decades of like like increased inequality. And for a long time we had been told, well, low wage workers, they're just not worth more money. Like $15 minimum wage, it would just bankrupt the whole thing. Like they're just not worth it. Well, what happened was during the labor shortages in COVID, we had millions of people drop out of the labor force. I mean, they didn't want to die, right? Or just or retired early or did things. And so when the customers came back quickly, they didn't have the workers, in particular, a lot of the service sector workers. And it turns out that if you need those workers, they're worth more, right? And so we saw people getting raises. We saw people getting accommodations. I think that's a big piece with like individuals with disabilities or women with children. Like a lot of people want to work. The jobs that can accommodate their schedules or their kind of needs and how they're just not there, except when the business is like desperate. And then it's like, oh, and I think some of this sticks. You realize, and this has been true for, working from home, which again, for some groups is a real accommodation. There are some employers that are like, don't like it, want to bring it back in, but some have figured out like, oh, actually, this works fine. So an accommodation that's made because you have to, because you absolutely need this worker, it can end up sticking around because you have like proof of concept. We've done it, and look, it's okay, and this person was worth it. And so the other thing that I get into with people, so we've had a very low unemployment rate, and I mean it's been below 4% for a longer stretch since the 1960s, right? It's now a little bit above 4, but it's been kind of right around there. And and of course, then inflation came, and so there was all this like, well, people don't care about the unemployment because inflation affects everyone, unemployment only affects 4% of people. And I'm like, but that's totally the wrong way to look at it, because the unemployment rate gives you a pulse on the labor market. It's giving you a pulse on the worst outcome, like I want a job and I can't find one. But I said when the unemployment rate is low, wage growth is high. There are more job opportunities. you're treated better. Like the whole thing is better off when unemployment is low. So everybody, most American workers, by like the vast majority of American workers have benefited from this labor market. And if you look at averages or medians, it's things like the wage rate have more than caught up with the higher price levels. I mean, I don't expect people to do that math in their heads. Like, I'm mad when I look at too, but like we would have had this inflation otherwise. Europe had this inflation, and we got the bigger paychecks too. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, clearly it was global, right? It was the aftermath of the pandemic with the supply chain crisis and the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well, which was a bigger issue in terms of gas prices in European countries, right? And yeah, so that was I always anyone who was kind of arguing it was a result of the stimulus. And like you said earlier, maybe some of the stimulus, maybe the final little bit was a bit too much. We can acknowledge that, right? But anyone who was saying it was a result of the stimulus, that inflation or cost of living crisis is just ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense at all, I don't think, when it's clearly a global shock, right? So I want to ask you what you think, because this leads to a lot of things that I want to talk about, but one of them is this notion of the NAIRU, right? So you talked about the dual mandate, and the Fed needs to control inflation, but also they have a duty not to let unemployment get too high. And these two have historically seemed to sit uneasily, right? It's been a balancing act. And there's been this notion that's underpinned Fed policy as well for a long time, and central bank policy across the world, called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU, which is basically there is a rate of unemployment below which you cannot go, or inflation is going to take off. Do you think that this idea, at least as it was used, as it was thought of, has been refuted by recent experience?
I have grown increasingly concerned, skeptical, I don't know, of tools like the NAIRU or even like the Phillips Curve, which just there's a trade off between
Yeah.
unemployment and inflation. I They're not precise, and in particular, they're not stable enough to be doing real time policy decision making. I've done a lot more thinking with the Phillips curve. I mean, that's because it's so simple. And there were policy advisors using very simple Phillips curves, pulling out a sacrifice ratio. So, like, what's the slope, the trade off, and then making pretty grandiose statements about how high unemployment had to go. Right. And these people were like, voice to policymakers. And we already knew that that relationship had not proved particularly stable. Like, the Phillips curve was flat, and then so what is that? And then, but it used to be more like, had it look like a curve, and I just watching. No, but the thing, and this is where it's tough with macro, because a lot of I'm a macroeconomist, you know, friends and people I respect who work in all different spaces, right? Because there are a lot of different ways to approach it. So I try not to just be the like macro is evil, though sometimes we are. But like with the Phillips curve, it frustrated me no end that there is a body of research that is very clear that when there is supply-driven inflation, the Phillips curve should either not be used, or you should be very careful with it, because the whole like underpinning of the model is it's about demand. Like, unemployment is about that is basically proxying for aggregate demand than versus inflation. And so it's like it has some merit when you're talking about demand driven inflation. It might still not be stable enough to use, but I mean, even conceptually, it doesn't make sense with when you have supply driven. And this is not like Greg Mankiw and Larry Ball had a paper about this in BPA 30 years
Right.
ago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? I see what happened.
Yeah.
Forget. So, it's one of those. It's like you have your tools, and you have to know when to use them and when to put them down. Just like I spent a lot of time this summer explaining why the Som Rule wasn't really fit for purpose right at this moment, because we had supply disruptions. Like,
Right.
it's
Okay.
not a good one. So I think but my big thing, and this goes with the neighbor, because the neighbor is one that, I mean, it's not the filter, but like the estimation, those estimates move around. We're not, and I think it puts if you lean too hard on it, it puts a false precision on the policymaking. I very much endorse the way the Fed has evolved, and it's even started under Yellen. You could see this where they didn't, they've tried hard not to get into this where the unemployment rate is too low. So we have to preemptively start raising rates. So they've been, and now they actually have in their document, they have a shortfall of of employment. So they're saying we're not going to react. They have very explicitly, we are not going to react to a low unemployment rate as long as inflation. I mean, if inflation looks okay, we're not going to go fight to get unemployment up. I think that one's going to get some scrutiny in the framework
Good.
review. But I like the way that they've moved on that. But and and I get it. As I was railing on about the Phillips curve last year, Paul Krugman at an event, he's like, okay, well, what would be your alternate? Like common sense. I don't know. Like so I get it that we need guideposts. We need models and theories.
Yeah.
So I don't want to really like chuck the whole thing, but I've been very disappointed with the way some of our tools have been used in the policy discussion.
I mean, what always interested me about the Naira, and I think Francis Coppola has made this point as well, is that it's the acceleration, right, of inflation. It's the third derivative, right, of prices. And I don't know, maybe you can correct me on this, but it seems if that's what you're worried about, that's what you should be looking at. But instead, people were looking at the inflation rate. They weren't looking at like the third derivative, right? I mean, maybe they were in policy circles and they just didn't know. But that strikes me as if Paul Krugman wants to keep some kind of rule, surely we could monitor that. Isn't that's what the theory says, right?
Yeah. Well, and in fact, because remember I said the Fed had got out of the business of the unemployment rate is too low. So in this inflation cycle, it really was about at first they were transitory. I mean, this thing was transitory. It was just too long. I mean, I wouldn't call it that anymore, but because it was clear there were supply-driven shocks from the pandemic. A central bank should look through supply-driven shocks. The thing was, it wasn't like a hurricane that just rolls in and rolls out. The pandemic wasn't transitory either. So, like, the timeline got very extended. And what the Fed finally saw that towards the end of 2021, when they're like, okay, we can't look through this anymore. We're going to start raising rates. Is the inflation started to spread. It was no longer just in sectors that one could look at and say, oh, that's supply chain this or that's a good thing. It started to spread into service sectors and in a pretty aggressive. So that's different from the third derivative, like the accelerationist, but it is an aspect of the breadth. And then it's like, well, we've got to step in because the Fed, their tool is definitely not ideal if you have supply driven inflation, but regardless of what kind of inflation you have, it is when it's more like the Fed's tool is diffuse. And so they certainly had a case when it starts looking like the inflation is diffuse as well. But yeah, I think it's my understanding that was what really kind of shook them into not just that the number was big, the headline number, but it was spreading.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's your opinion on, and I suppose this relates to the Som Rule, right, and fiscal versus monetary policy. What's your opinion on having a much more general, holistic framework to manage inflation and the macroeconomy and people? This is a bit like MMT stuff, all right. Isabella Weber's also talked about it, like where you sort of monitor specific bottlenecks and there's a kind of expansion into the areas that are affected to try and monitor specific sectors. Because it does seem to me, and Weber wrote a paper on this, right, about systemically important sectors. It does seem to me that is what happened with the cost of living crisis. Very clearly, it was like a few sectors that were driving anything, not least energy. Also, there was microchips and everything. But I mean, do you think that that's a possibility to have something that's a bit more bulky, that oversees a greater number of markets, not just the money market? Does that make sense to you as a policy? Does that seem like something you'd like to see?
So first, I'll say I'm a huge fan of Weber's. She's awesome. That's one of the thin silver linings of this crisis has been getting to know her and Stephanie Kelton well, because it's so good to have like talk to people who have different viewpoints than like who you'd normally be interacting with. And so I am an absolute adherent to the idea that like we cannot ask the Fed to go it alone on inflation. Like they will go it alone. They have a job to fight inflation. But when I would hear members of Congress, even the president, be like, well, inflation is high. And actually, they'd often say it in terms of, yes, food inflation, energy inflation is high, and how, but the Fed is on it. And I'm like, you have really just named like the areas of inflation, which are very important, but are also not real great for monetary policy, right? Like you gotta have a really high interest rate to destroy enough demand for food or other things, to get food prices down. Like that isn't the way you want to do it. So I think I don't like the Fed go it alone, even on inflation. Right. I think absolutely in terms of stabilization policy, it's a mistake, but on inflation, and the U.S. very much benefited from having the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. One of the things that Biden, in addition to opening it up and putting supply of oil out, um, and the U.S., though we're the world's largest oil producer, that did not keep us away from having $5 a gallon gas. Like we had a really big gasoline, had a big increase in gasoline price. Now the U.S. energy situation was not anywhere like Europe's, but this was very unpopular when gas prices went up after the Russia invaded Ukraine. So, but the other thing that Biden did, and this, like, they don't talk about this because Democrats aren't supposed to be like pro energy policy, like fossil fuels. But what the other thing they did is they had contracts written with energy producers, domestic energy producers, giving them a guaranteed price to sell back into the reserve. So they helped incentivize the production because energy can be kind of a feast or famine in terms of the prices. And so there was some reluctance by investors to go in and have energy companies like drill more because maybe the prices would collapse. So I think so. I am this idea of having reserves makes sense to me. It's hard to know what. I mean, Isabel has some very good research on what sectors one would want to focus on. Uh, One place that I think, like if Marcus Brunemeyer has a really nice book. It's all the Germans thinking so thoughtfully about this. Marcus Brunemeyer has a nice book.
Marcus Brunemeyer.
Yeah, has on, I think it's called The Resilient Economy. And so it's a lot about these kind of, not just supply, but other kinds of risk, kind of non-economic risks, and what it means to have an economy that, like a robust economy, when the shock hits, would just like stand tall. The idea of the resilient economy is like it bends and then it bounces back into shape, right? Like we're not going to be so fortified that nothing bad happens, but we want to come back quickly. And the one that has really stuck with me, I was like arguing with someone on Twitter about this morning, is the housing supply. Because the U.S., I mean, we went into COVID with a pre-existing condition of not enough housing. And then unfortunately, the sad reality is with a housing underbuild, if something good happens in the labor market, you end up with inflation. Because there's not, like we had a real burst of household formation early in the recovery, and it really like scrambled both like rental prices, house prices, and I mean monetary, like the whole thing in the housing. But it's like, and it's still the biggest contributor to the consumer price inflation. And that it's like you can't have a strategic reserve of homes, right? But you could say we're going to pay a lot more attention to our supply vulnerabilities. In good times, we're going to get those fixed up, so that like when we go into the recession, we go into a crisis, they don't like fall apart. Because I mean, fiscal in recessions had gone, was still done because I mean, Congress is going to do something in a recession, but I don't think it was developed for many years. But there's a lot of fiscal, like outside of recessions, that has fallen by the wayside. I think he did 3 big investment packages, and we had infrastructure week, and there were some programs done in the last 4 years, but in general, and not all, and U.S. is a federal setup, so some of the issues like housing really is down at sometimes at the very local level, or where the problems are starting.
Yeah, I mean, housing's a really funny one as well. Is it does seem to be, in some ways it's the issue, right? I think, and there's the whole housing theory of everything that some people put forward, and it always seems to come up. I mean, one of the things about housing as well that really bothers me is that homelessness rises in a boom, right? That's like a kind of stylized fact because house prices tend to go
Mm.
up, right? And I mean, I know, you're not necessarily a housing economist, but I don't know if it's necessarily a macroeconomic issue, even though it is affected by the macroeconomy. But I guess it's just something that a lot of countries, I mean, the US and UK are probably prime candidates for this, have done really badly for a long time, and that massively affects people's cost of living, manifesting in the extreme in homelessness. And it seems to, it goes up in booms, but it's not so great in busts either, like everything else. I mean, what do you sort of see as some of the solutions there? Do you have a sense of that? Do you follow
Mhm.
housing policy as well?
So, in fact, I wrote a piece for Bloomberg Opinion last year. I think it was last year about homelessness and a proposal in California. So, Governor Newsom. So wrote critically of his proposal. His proposal had been to essentially allow the state to put homeless individuals into conservatorship, so forcibly put them in mental institutions. I mean, if they had mental health conditions. Anyway, so this
Mm.
was his solution to homelessness, which put them in hospitals. Now, it is
Yeah.
true that there are high rates of prevalence of substance abuse and mental health conditions. So, like, yeah, and people should get care for what they need. And if
Mm.
you're homeless, you're probably not getting access even like you wanted. Now you don't have forced on you, But most of my piece was on, and I got a lot of hate mail, uh, or a lot of disagreement. That I mean, California has like one of the most broken housing markets. Right? People end up homeless because they do not have a place. They don't have a home, and often, when you have such high prices and low availability, and then there's a lot of demand, right? Like if you have high occupancy rates, also home, like if you have a landlord, there's like get out of here, right? Like, they're not going to try and accommodate, like, oh, you missed one paycheck, just give me a couple weeks, right? Like there's no accommodations of this stuff. So you have, if it's so thin, the margin of like making the rent, staying in the, then you're one bad event away from
Yeah.
losing it. And homelessness in the U.S., there's a lot of churn, right? Like people become homeless and then are out of home. Like it's a symptom of a problem. I mean, there's probably lots of problems, but there definitely is a problem on the housing. So, I mean, my Bloomberg opinion piece, where I often like go through and like identify a problem and have some criticism, and then I'll try to offer solutions. And one of the solutions I was putting out there, and there certainly are areas in California that are trying to do this, was you got to build. Like there's no way around this, and it's extremely unpopular. I mean, if you're a middle class or upper middle class
Mm.
homeowner in a nice neighborhood, yeah, I mean, Newsom's solution sounds a lot better. You keep your house, you buy more, you building more homes, making homes more affordable will have an effect on house prices. And for many Americans who have homes, that is their wealth. So I get it, like why we don't make forward progress. But you're right. I wouldn't go as far as the theory of everything, but housing is so central to people's lives,
Mm.
and when it's messed up, and it is like it's not just the U.S. or the U.K. I mean, it really seems to be a very advanced economy issue.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it goes back to interest rates as well, right? Because housing is one of the main things affected by it, and it's sort of. I've had people sort of say this to me in real life, like non-economists. They're like, "Well, why is the answer to a cost of living crisis to increase our cost of living, right? Why is because a mortgage is such a big cost for so many people, or if you're a renter, it might be passed on to you, right? It's like that seems really absurd to most people, and I mean, you can give them a sort of economist's answer, right? And it does, on aggregate, reduce inflation, increasing interest rates, right? But it causes a lot of pain in the process, and it seems quite absurd that that's our policy.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate they recognize, an interest rate is just a price. It's the price of time. Like,
Yeah.
do you consume now? Do you consume later? And then our models, like, it's all very neat and tidy. The Fed raises interest rates, and so people just save and don't consume, right? Like, and typically that's not. I mean, in the real world, it's more. Things become unaffordable. You're destroying demand. People are having to choose between different things that they need. Um, but it does. I mean, the Fed's tool is to reduce demand. The demand like that's happening right now, in a good sense, would be like, oh, you save it and then you'll get to spend it later. But if it, Powell's 2020 Jackson Hole's 2022 Jackson Hole speech, which I like to refer to as the "there will be pain." I mean, that's just the way the Fed works, right? So we were very fortunate that there were offsetting
Yeah.
factors, like a really strong labor market, but like that's just the tool they got. And yeah, it is. It's very kludgy, but fiscal policy can be, like, it can be very powerful, but it can be really hard to implement. And that's why I love to see people like Isabella, who is so thoughtful and careful and looks at input output tables and different, really tries to think through it, because if you want to do something that's like a price control, or I'm a big potential proponent, I'm not enough an expert on it, but like a proponent of like the temporary taxes on extraordinary profits. So, like, I mean, exactly what the energy companies, like, no company should be profiting from a global pandemic or a war in Europe, right? And there are ways to do this, that, to structure them so that they don't disincentivize future investments. And I mean, you can be very upfront about it. It's just those tools have so not been in the toolkit since for decades. And even mentioning it, I mean, the reason I got to know Isabella is like the night on Twitter where they just like, Paul Krugman called her out, and it was just this like frenzy of people angry at her for even writing an op-ed, just being like, in the past they've done these control. It was like totally not an aggressive op-ed, but it was just like watching the reaction. And I mean, I certainly see reactions like that when Stephanie Kelton puts ideas out there. But it was just, so I'm happy people like Isabella are working on details, because if we put fiscal in a bigger role, it needs to be done in a very thoughtful way, because there are good ways to intervene, and then there are bad ways. So, and fiscal has a less of a record on inflation, but those have also, I mean, the inflation uh, cycles have been less frequent than the recessions. So we also just don't have as much kind of practice.
Yeah, that's true. It's like a break, isn't it? I always think that Weber's proposal is like a break. It's not, God's plan. I think that's what people who are reacting. I mean, aside from their conduct, which is whatever, it's embarrassing, but like they're not distinguishing between like that, like saying you should centrally plan the entire economy, control every price, quantity, quality, whatever, right? It's like it's an emergency break, and really it's something that's about the rate of change. Again, it's a distinction between levels and rates, I think, because it's like, has the price been jacked up massively in this emergency, resulting in windfall profits, like you said? And do you put the brakes on that, right? And is it a temporary thing? And so on, right? You can design it in a completely different way to just saying, the price of milk has to be $1 forever, as well as the price of everything else. It's such a different policy. But you're right. I mean, the reaction to it was ridiculous. People weren't seeing the nuances. And like you said, the fact that we have done that before, that has happened before. And so maybe there's scope to think about doing it in a better way, in a complex and nuanced way, with the proper state capacity and everything. I think, I mean, I don't know if that's looking like something that's going to happen, but it does seem like something that would be really sensible to me.
Yeah. Well, there certainly has been more of a conversation around inflation and policy, various kinds. So, and this was coming out of the Great Recession. There had been a lot of conversation about that was not a good recovery. And then when the pandemic came, there was a much more robust response. So this could be very well planting the seeds of future policy efforts. It's just, we're still in the middle of, well, I mean, we're past the inflation surge, but there's still, it's like it's too early to write the history of what's happening, and to craft the policies. But I think it's there is a lot of thoughtfulness in the discussion, and then there's a lot of ideological noise. But fiscal policies like that.
I mean, returning to housing, right? So yeah. Yeah, it is. Though, I mean, returning to housing, it's like rent control, second generation rent controls are something that I think has been discussed again, and they're once more complex than people appreciate. They want to do the first generation standard supply and demand rent control analysis where it creates a shortage of houses, but actually that's not how second generation rent controls work. They're much more in line with the type of thing Weber would be talking about. They're much more complex. There's much more room for increasing rents if it's justified, right? But that's the crucial thing. It's like when it's not justified and it just is an exploitation of monopoly power or circumstance, and it creates a hardship for a lot of people. I want to talk. So one, if I've have you got more time? How are you doing for time?
Yeah, okay. A little bit more.
Okay. I want to do. I want to ask you about something slightly different, because you've been talking a lot about how good the recovery is, right? And the wage compression at the bottom. It's been quite good for low wage workers, especially, and people with disabilities and so on. There's this thing, this big debate that's emerged about the vibe session, right? There's been this big debate about how the vibes are off. The subjective indicators of how people think the economy is doing are departing from objective indicators like GDP, unemployment, so on, wages. They're also departing from people's own subjective assessment of their own situation. So if you ask people about the economy as a whole, they say it's doing badly. If they ask people how their economy is, the majority of people say they're doing well. And I just saw when I was on the news, I just saw a Gallup poll saying that most Americans feel that they're worse off than 4 years ago, right? And bear in mind, 4 years ago was like the heart of the pandemic. I mean, what do you think's going on here? What's going on with this whole thing? Because it's such a contentious debate.
Yeah. Right. So I have written multiple pieces at both Bloomberg and on my Substack about this. And I have thought about it because, well, for one, when I was at the Fed, I worked on consumer spending, and I was the lead on consumer sentiment. I went to University of Michigan. That's where the big survey's from. Like, I used that survey for my research, right? So to me, it's like what people tell us, like they're telling us something, right? The sentiment is telling us something. It's not the same as looking at GDP or looking at income. It's people rolling it all up and then giving an assessment. So it's always hard to work with. But before the Great Recession, U.S. families, they called that recession before the economists did. Like, I can remember sitting in the boardroom at some briefing in late 2007, and the governor was like, "What is wrong with these people in the Michigan survey?" Like, because all the other indicators are fine, they look good, and then we've got these Michigan people just like getting more and more pessimistic. He's like, "Oh, there's just like 500 of them. Can we just call them up and ask what's going on?" I'm just like, this is not my favorite governor. Anyways, but it's like, no, these are 500 very special people, because they're representative. So I have been, with that background and training, like, it really took me a while to wrap my head around the idea that these sentiment numbers are next to useless for what I'm doing right now as an economist. And it was a real process, and I still keep an eye on them, because I think the factors that are getting pulled into the sentiment numbers could be temporary, and so maybe eventually, so if they stay negative, it could be like because bad things are happening. But especially after because I had a piece, and this was from also well over a year ago, most Americans are better off financially. I wrote this piece. And that's absolutely more true now than it was then, because time, wages have continued to increase, whatever. I actually got like death threats over this one. That was like kind of stupid from a lefty
Oh
too.
God.
That was kind of neat. But but for that piece, what I did, and when I talk about this, like I went to surveys of households that asked them, what is your income? What is your wealth? What are your, employment status? Like say all these ingredients of financial well-being, right? Where if you ask people directly, and I look at that and it's like relative to 4 years ago, relative to before the pandemic, like it's, I think for that piece, I might have gone back to pre-pandemic, but I mean, it doesn't like, I'm like, I'm not doing the politics here. I just want to, it's like, and the 4 years also will carry through. And it's like, I'm not, they're like, oh, you're lying. And da, da, da. I'm like, no, I am sharing what people who take these surveys, who are representative of Americans, are telling us. And I did a Planet Money episode on this, and I said at the end, I was like, okay, I spent a lot of time with this. I'm really thinking, I want to understand what those sentiment numbers are trying to tell me. Because they're not, I don't have the right lens. Like, it's different than before. And I think, it could be things like, I think COVID kind of broke us. Like, and so there's just this extra pessimism. There's a lot of
Yeah,
politics,
sure.
partisanship. I mean, we're a divided country, so I have a hard time with that one, like skewing everything, because like it ought to counterbalance. But I think and like we have a negativity bias that is off the charts right now in terms of the way information is shared and amplified. And so like there were all these things I said, I could see that, but I said the sentiment numbers looked at their worst as bad. No, they looked worse than the 1970s. At no point in the last 4.5 years has our economy been worse than the 1970s. Like, I mean, not even close. So, but I had one woman who I got a lot of emails after the Planet Money, like people email me. And one woman made the point, she's like, my family, we look better off on paper, but we don't feel better off because what about like tomorrow? Like it could all fall apart again. And I was like, I mean, that to me, that's kind of the damage of COVID. Like we were in a really good place, generally speaking, and it just like wiped us out. So there is a sense of like, you don't know what's around the next corner. And then I thought too, I was like at that time, I was like, some of my peers have been for like 2 years telling you a recession is imminent. I don't know, might feel a little less secure. So there's something is going on that like, yes, when inflation is high, people are downbeat. Yes, when, like there were reasons for sentiment to be lower, but it was like this extra on top that I don't, I mean, uncertainty could be one thing. I think I think she was really hit on something that's important, but I have a strong sense that much of that disconnect or much of those extra vibes, they're not economics. Like in the sense that I'm trained to do economics.
Yeah.
And so I try very hard to stay in my lane. But yeah, but it has been fascinating to me. I mean, I had to take a break from Twitter for a while, but like how viscerally angry people get when you tell them there's something good about the economy. And I'm like,
I've had literally the same thing. I clash with people. The thing is, it's like, it's such a tricky area because obviously there's the obvious thing. You can't tell people how to feel, right? Yep. So that's obvious, right? No data can tell you how to feel, including data on how other people are feeling. That can't tell you how to feel. You feel the way you feel, and that's that. That's a fact, right? And then there's the other point, which is the familiar statistical point about averages and stuff. Even if the economy is doing super well, like feasibly everybody watching, listening to this could be doing badly, right? Because that's a statistical blip. It's nothing, right? It's not going to count, right? So that you can't speak to how individuals feel, and you can't speak to how individuals are doing, which I think is why it makes people so angry. But at the same time, the question is, how do you monitor the economy, right? Like, how do we know? Because there's something that happened in the data that had never really happened before, which is that two measures diverge, the consumer sentiment and the kind of more objective indicators, right? And that needs to be explained. Now, whether you attach something normative or you're telling people they feel the wrong way, I think that depends on how you frame it, and you shouldn't necessarily do that. But like, there is something to be explained there, right? And it's the way you just approached it now. It's a puzzle, and maybe it has something to do with COVID, maybe it has something to do with politics. I don't know, maybe it has something to do with climate change. I don't know. All of these things seem to be
no, and it's
like,
it's
go ahead.
picking up. I mean, yeah, and I absolutely agree with you. Don't tell people how to feel. It's like marriage counseling 101. We don't tell get feelings. And I also, when I have people come at me, I'm like, you don't get to have your own facts either. Like, you can have your own feelings, you can't have your own facts. So, and one thing that I've done, and other people also, like looking into this, I mean, for my post in particular, I said most Americans, that was very specific. Most means the median, right? So I'm going in distributional data. Like, I'm not just looking at like GDP.
Sure.
It's like looking at the household. And we have, I mean, the US at least, we have a wealth of fairly disaggregated, relatively real time data. Like, they're not perfect, but we have so much more ability to kind of say who's benefiting. And I mean, frankly, this labor market was best for the bottom. I mean, they were earning far too little before, and so it's easy off a small number to get a big increase, but like percentage increase. But it's just but I think what it came into was, the economy is like supposed to be number one election issue, and it's a big, it's just an important always kind of issue. But it's like I ran into a lot in like 2022, particularly with inflation that was, had really taken off. And there early in 2022, there was talk about, oh, we're in a recession. Like, I was sitting at home one night watching TV, and Cardi B like tweeted out, "We're in a recession." And I just looked at it and I was like, "Oh, tomorrow's going to be rough." And in fact, I got like all of it like recession. But it's like, no, see, we have inflation. Inflation is bad. Inflation is not in any way, shape, or form a metric of are we in a recession or not. Like, you can have a recession with high inflation or low inflation. Like, that's not. But inflation is bad.
Yeah.
Recession is bad. If we have one, well, we must have the other. Like, there's all this kind of emotional transference onto economic terms. Which, I mean, I don't like. I'm not judging it, but it's like, for me, like, those sentiment numbers, if they hadn't had these extra factors, I mean, they would have been really. The Michigan survey was calling a recession by the end of 2021, and like, they looked awful. I mean, they looked awful in 2022. And so, I mean, if that really had tied up to other economic aggregates, we would have had a pretty bad recession. So I don't, I take it seriously. I think, to do my job in terms of giving economic policy advice, or just like reading like, hey, this is what I see happening in the economy. Like, it doesn't, I can deal with like, oh, there's this extra piece that's not really economics. I can kind of try. It may take me a little while to kind of figure out like how concerned should I be about this? How much time should I put into it? But I don't have to sell this economy. I have to sell. Like, I have to try and help people making economic decisions. But I do think it's been. I don't think the administration has risen to the challenge of engaging on the economic policy. I mean, it's tough, but it's not impossible to explain what's going on. But, whatever. Again, I'm not in politics for very good reason.
I actually, there is a question. It's funny, that leads me to the final thing I was going to ask you, which somebody asked in chat. And given what you just said, you made demur. But what is your opinion of like the economic impact of the two candidates? Do you have opinions on this? How do you think it will go in each case?
So the first thing to say is that the policies that we have right now from the two campaigns, these are campaign policies. These candidates are trying to get elected. So it is all about getting votes. In some ways, I think you can look at the campaign policies and they tell us more about who they think their base is, or maybe what they think the median independent voter in Pennsylvania wants to do. I mean, these really are not, they're not people will talk about, oh, there's not a lot of details. I don't have the details. And I'm like, it wouldn't matter. Like with these, they're just campaign policies. So I try to pay attention to what they're putting out there, but I try not to go down the rabbit hole of, like, I certainly don't have a model where I hit the button and it pops out some number of GDP effects or something. The and also with, at the end of the day, for the economic input, the economic impact, the details of the policies will be very important. The details of the policies are going to depend on who's in the White House, who's in the House, who's in the Senate. Right. So we will need to know all of those actors and then how much margins they have, blah blah blah. So we're far away from there being an actual, potentially real proposal. Now, but I don't want to just write off proposals that are out there. I think from the Trump campaign, the piece, the proposals he has around immigration, and in particular the mass deportation, like I look at that and I don't think that could possibly happen. I don't think they could even run Mar-a-Lago without some undocumented labor. So I don't think the business lobby in the United States would allow that to happen. And yet I take very seriously. I mean, he does say it, it's in the platform. It's clear there's a base for that anti-immigrant policy. And like, that would be just disastrous. Like that one, I mean, I'm not a big, like, oh, the death is big, the sky will fall. Like, I'm not MMT, but I'm also not, like, that doesn't get my hair on fire. But pulling millions of people out of the U.S. labor force with no replacement. I mean, in addition to all of the humanitarian aspects of it, the economics of it would be really bad. But I don't think it's going to happen. So it's kind of like, makes me uncomfortable that that's in the rhetoric, but it's not, and that would be just like outlandishly bad. The one thing that on the Harris side that I don't think will maybe get across the finish line, but I appreciate her putting it there, is they have a set of policies on housing. And, they have one of the very standard, like, tax credits for new home buyers, blah, blah, blah. And that one probably what they can do. I mean, the government is pretty good at, like, writing checks like this. But that on its own doesn't do anything and probably could make, to some extent, the housing crisis worse because you're subsidizing demand. But she also has in her proposal build units, build housing, like with some different incentives. So it's really the first time I've seen a clear like housing supply push in federal legislation. There's a lot of people say, well, it's not going to really be able to do it, and because again, the levers really are down at the state and even the very local level. But that was one where I was like, I could see that. That would just the idea of trying to, if nothing else, use the bully pulpit to move that. Because I think, and I was kind of surprised that Trump really doesn't have anything on housing. Because to me, that really is like in the inflation piece, right, which still has people animated. I mean, housing that's the big driver that's left. So I don't know, but in terms of the specific, and there are places where they have a fair bit of overlap. And like, there's some, the industrial policy bringing back, trying to like source jobs domestically. Now, I don't want to do the like both sidesism because the degree to which, like, say, the tariffs would be put in place is just wildly different between the two. So, I mean, I don't know. But the extent to which anything happens will, Congress will be a big wild card in this too, because it's not like bipartisanship is coming back anytime soon. So, the odds on is that very little gets done in terms of fiscal.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, I guess. I mean, I guess the way to think about Kamala is probably a continuation of the current policy, really, right? Whereas Trump, although it is interesting how there is this bipartisanship on industrial policy and some tariffs, certainly tariffs on China, that really interests me. But then Trump was saying 20% on everything, right? And I don't know if that would be achievable, but that is like that's not industrial policy. That's something completely different, right? Not to mention the immigrant policy, which I don't understand. Just taking purely economically taking a bunch of people out of the workforce and deporting them is just like it seems a bit insane. But okay, well, thanks so much. I mean, this has been such a wide-ranging chat. I've got so many notes. I could have asked you about 50 more things, and we didn't even talk about your work on the culture of the economics profession, but that's been tireless as well. But anyway, so it's been super interesting, Claudia. And somebody in the chat, you might like to know, called you the Keynes of our time, which I think is completely fair.
Oh, that's
so
yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us, and have a nice day.
All right, take care. Thank you. Bye.